So as we're changing computers, it gives me the perfect time to introduce Connie Kasari from UCLA. Connie got her Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina. She then came to UCLA a long time ago now to do her postdoctoral fellowship. And since then, she's developed one of the leading treatment research programs in the world. She's a professor both in the School of Education and the Department of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences. Her work really underlies a lot of the rationale for some of the treatment programs, including this partial day hospitalization program at UCLA that's highly successful. And she leads now many large collaborative grants and studies funded by the National Institute of Health as well as the Department of Maternal and Child Health. So these large networks of collaborators all around the country. She has over 50 publications in this area. And I think she's going to talk today about a very specific area of her research that I think is very important because it's been, a lot of what she's doing now is focusing on areas that have really been underserved in some ways. Either the older kids who are in school or the younger, kids as they're transitioning. So I'll let her go and explain it better than I can.
Thanks. Good morning. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit. And we're going to talk about an area that's maybe less well known, actually, than maybe genetics or brain imaging, and that's treatment research. So surprisingly, there haven't been as many studies funded for treatment research, and that's just now beginning to change. So we hope to learn a lot more about treatments in particular, and then hopefully in the future, sort of linking genes and brain and behavior. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about peer relationships and interventions and friendships for kids with ASD. So why do we think that social lives at school in particular are important? And we know from typical studies, just typical children, that peer interactions and academic engagement are really important. So that what happens to kids socially at school really affects how well they do academically. So I also think that one piece that we often miss is that friendships and social development of kids affects parents and families, right? You could probably all relate to your children's social relationships at school. And in general, kids who are more connected to their classmates and to their school situation do better academically. So it's a really important area of research. So what do we know about kids' situation at school? It's really very much true that that some children at school have very few friends, or they don't really feel connected to anyone. And this doesn't matter if you're typically developing or if you have ASD. It's also true that not very many adults in the kids' world are really focused on their social situation. For example, teachers aren't out on the playground. They usually have playground assistants. And most adults feel that recess is really a time away from adult intrusion. So they let kids go out on the playground and just play because all kids know how to play, right? And so their goal really is to keep kids safe and not really to worry about kids' connections to each other. So what do we know about social skills programs for kids who are having difficulty with social relationships? So most of you know that the common practice for kids with ASD is to attend a social skills group, right? And there's always a range in the composition of those groups. So for the most part, it's other kids with ASD or other kids with social difficulties. And these are usually privately funded and off campus. And there are also differences in how people go about teaching social skills. So it might be discrete behaviors such as greeting or entering a group or how to make a conversation go. It may be just about identifying emotions. So you actually do see groups of kids who are being taught how to actually identify a face. So they're all sitting around a table and they might just have to identify the emotion in a face. There's no interaction going on, right? And this is social skills. So you have this incredible variability in terms of the curriculums for social skills group. Let's see. I always have this little delay. I don't know why. Okay. Well, there have been several recent reviews of the evidence of these social skills groups. And lo and behold, there's very little evidence that they work, even though they're very pervasive in practice. And the issues that have been pointed out is that they're off campus, so they're unrelated to the child's actual school situation, or they involve a one-on-one assistant who is really good at interacting with the child, but not always great at encouraging peer-to-peer interactions. Another problem with common practice now is that you will have a one-on-one assistant in the classroom. That one-on-one assistant oftentimes will mark the child in the sense that it takes them out of that social milieu. So kids do need direct instruction for what they don't understand, and they need practice. But how we go about doing that may affect how well they stay connected to their classmates and school situation. Let's see. All right. So our interest has been in children with autism spectrum disorders who are in regular classrooms. And I actually see kids that are high functioning with ASD as being an underserved population. Underserved because they're often not offered any additional services. So our questions have been the extent to which children with ASD are isolated or involved in their school social networks, and the degree of their understanding of their relationships with others. I want to show you a couple of kids from the kids themselves. Both of these little boys were in an early intervention program that we also ran when they were 3. So both of them got this very directed interventions to develop their language skills. Both boys were sort of developmentally at the same age at age 3. Both made a lot of progress in that treatment program and were talking by the time they ended the treatment, which in that study was 6 weeks. So now we saw them again when they were in 3rd grade, both of them fully included, both with normal IQ, and both 8 years of age. So just think about the way in which we're asking them questions about being teased at school, kind of their relationships at school, and their awareness.
Do you get along good with the kids at school?
Yeah.
Yeah. Are there sometimes things that they do that make you mad or irritate you?
No.
No? Pretty good. Do kids ever tease you?
No.
Do you ever tease kids?
No.
Oh, okay, good.
So what do you think? You think he's being teased at school? Yeah. So and you know, he doesn't tell us that, but his mother reports that he's very isolated at school and he's being teased. But his awareness of that is just not there. So even though he's, has normal IQ and can do the academic work, he's not so aware of his social situation. So here's another little guy.
Were you ever teased or bullied at school?
I think so, but not really. I think so. Maybe a long time ago. Maybe, I don't know.
You don't remember?
No.
You
Yeah,
know?
no. I don't. Not even bullied. I never saw that bullied.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever try to change things so that other people won't tease you?
Yeah, but it doesn't work.
It doesn't work?
Yeah.
What have you tried?
I tried being nice to them, trying to be happy and do stuff that I'm supposed to do when bullies are bullying me or something. But it doesn't always work.
It doesn't always work?
Yeah.
Does it work sometimes?
Yeah, sometimes.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay, so he's more aware of his situation, and his mother does report teasing at school. And his sort of strategy for dealing with the bully is to go along and try to make them happy. So that's a strategy, but it's probably not very effective. Right, so those are these are 2 examples of kids that show you the variability that you're going to see in kids' understanding of their social situation, even in the same grade, fully included, normal IQ, can do the academic work, but come at this from very different places. So we were interested in, how involved kids were in their classroom, social network. So we did a study of social networks and just asked that question, are the kids isolated or are they involved in their social networks? So if you could answer that question, if you could imagine that kids with one child with autism and a whole class of more neurotypical children, do you think that child would be isolated or do you think they'd be really well connected with their classmates? You think they would be isolated. If you listen to the clinical reports, you would think, wow, they probably don't have any friends. And in fact, all of the literature, at least on older kids, is that they rarely have good friends or they may not even have acquaintances. So right, you would predict isolation. So we did a study of second and third graders, so they're fairly young, and we found that they were less involved with their classmates, but not a single one of them was isolated. All right, so we were really encouraged by these data. Now they were great programs because people that wouldn't let us come into the classrooms may have had different situations. And of course, doing work in schools is really difficult because anyone can say no, right? The principal, the teacher, the other parents. So, it's very hard to get in the first place. We did find in these young kids that boys were more often connected to groups of girls. So small networks, and there were isolated kids in these classes, by the way. They just weren't our kids, which was great. But the girls were the ones who sort of brought the little boys along. All right, so we decided we would do a follow-up study of a broader age range and try to get into a more diverse school district. So we were in Los Angeles Unified, which is pretty diverse. And we had a study of 60 high-functioning kids with ASD from 1st to 5th grade. They were all fully included. And we have a very much a more complicated picture. We also, again, found that children have smaller social networks, right? So in other words, they're identifying fewer kids to play with, and fewer kids are identifying them as playmates. And the way we go about doing this is we just ask kids to tell us who hangs out with whom on the playground. So you ask the class, very simple question, and they all say, oh, it's Johnny and Joey and so on, and you get everyone's reports, and then you do a pretty complicated sort of matrix and try to correlate all of those different responses so that you get some strength of those social networks. We did also find in this larger group of kids that our kids receive more do not want to play with nominations, all right? So in other words, they have smaller networks and other kids are not choosing them as often to play with. Okay, so when we look at this larger group, we do have a more complicated picture. This is a picture of the map. So these are all now kids that are reduced down to numbers and letters. But you can see that these networks of kids, there are some very tight groups, and then there are kids that are out here on the periphery, all right? So kids who are just nominated to like one other child, or they might be hanging on to a larger group like this one, they're more peripheral, right? Versus the kid who's really well connected here with other kids. So what we find in this larger group of kids is that we have more isolated kids. Less than 15% of the kids are isolated. But most of the kids, like we found in our last study, are peripheral, sort of hanging on to a larger group or one other kid. But a pretty good percentage of the kids are secondary. In other words, they're not the most popular kids in the classroom, but they're pretty connected. And then we actually had some kids who were popular. I think it's about 9% of the kids were actually popular. So, like the genes and like brain development, we also see all this heterogeneity in the kids' situation.